Harlem, 1956. The streets glisten with frost, a brittle silence hanging over the avenues as if the city itself were holding its breath. In the middle of this ordinary winter afternoon, a Cadillac's engine purred against the wind, its black frame cutting through shadows like a blade. Behind the tinted glass, Bumpy Johnson sat, a figure of contradiction. He was a man whose name struck fear and commanded respect across every corner of Harlem, yet in this moment, he was about to confront something far more unsettling than rival gangsters or federal agents: the raw, unshielded desperation of human life on the brink of collapse. Elizabeth Carter, 72 and weathered by decades of poverty, stood frozen in the street, her eyes locked on the tinted window where Bumpy's gaze would soon meet hers. Her body trembled not just from the cold, but from exhaustion, hunger, and the bruises that marked her face. She had seen enough of Harlem's cruelty to know that asking for help from a man like Bumpy Johnson was a gamble. Yet, in that moment, all avenues had closed. The city's welfare system offered her $3 a month after rent, and the relentless winter had extinguished heat and light from her apartment. Hunger gnawed at her, unrelenting. Inside the Cadillac, Bumpy's driver tensed. Houlette's hand hovered over a .45, the instincts of a man who had survived 2 assassination attempts informing every muscle. But Bumpy Johnson's focus was elsewhere. He saw the pain etched into the lines of Elizabeth's face, the kind of pain no street fight or federal raid could replicate. In the world he dominated, power was measured in money, territory, and loyalty. But here, in this fragile pause between human desperation and survival, he confronted a type of influence far subtler and far more profound: moral leverage over life itself. Elizabeth approached slowly, each step in negotiation with her own failing body. Bumpy lowered the window and spoke, his voice calm but edged with authority. He offered warmth, a momentary shield from the biting air, yet he demanded truth. Her story spilled in broken fragments: rent unpaid, lights cut, heat gone, food non-existent. Then the bruise emerged, a mark inflicted not by circumstance, but by her son Edward, a man defeated by alcohol, rage, and the city's indifference. Bumpy listened without interruption, his mind weaving a tapestry of Harlem's underworld, the alliances, betrayals, and silent codes that governed its survival. But this narrative was different. Here was a mother, trapped in a system that failed her, confronting a man whose hands had dispensed violence, protection, and wealth in equal measure. And in that Cadillac, amidst frost and fear, the first fissure appeared in the armor Bumpy Johnson had spent decades constructing around himself: the undeniable weight of human vulnerability. This encounter would not remain private. It would ripple across streets, back alleys, and whispered corridors, setting into motion decisions that would test loyalty, justice, and the limits of power in a city already steeped in crime. And in those moments, as Elizabeth Carter looked in the eyes of a gangster who had seen it all, she unknowingly forced Bumpy to confront a truth few in Harlem ever saw. Even in the darkest world, survival could demand empathy, calculation, and the exercise of unspoken authority. Bumpy Johnson did not move through Harlem as a man without structure. His dominion was built on meticulously maintained hierarchies, the kind of silent order that most outsiders never perceived. Every street corner, every gambling house, every policy shop operated under a system of mutual dependence and unspoken enforcement. Loyalty was currency, fear was collateral, and betrayal was a debt collected in blood or exile. Bumpy's intelligence network stretched from dock workers to doormen, from small-time hoods to corrupt officials, each link in the chain feeding him information and, more importantly, obedience. Yet in that Cadillac, Elizabeth Carter's desperation intersected with that network in a way no one had anticipated. Here was a woman outside the system, invisible to every ledger and ledger keeper, yet her suffering demanded immediate action. For Bumpy, this was not charity. It was enforcement of an informal justice, a correction to the blind cruelty of a city that permitted the weak to wither. His wealth, accumulated through numbers games and the black market economy of Harlem, became a tool for intervention. $100 in cash, a restored apartment, and a confrontation with a son spiraling into self-destruction, each element a calculated strike against both circumstance and human folly. Edward Carter existed in a different world entirely, one defined by the collapse of opportunity and the tyranny of addiction. Once intelligent and ambitious, he had been chewed up by systemic racism and economic neglect, the kind of slow violence that turned potential into ruin. Factory jobs lost, docks that offered no respect. Every door slammed in his face until the bottle became both solace and weapon. His assault on his mother was not born of cruelty alone, but of desperation, a misdirected assertion of control in a life stripped bare. And now, his actions would intersect with Bumpy Johnson's authority, a collision that would illuminate the limits of criminal power and the thin line between punishment and protection. Inside the Cadillac, Bumpy's assessment extended beyond the immediate threat of Edward's behavior. He traced the implications of intervention across his network. His lieutenants, the street crews, the bodyguards who would execute his will if necessary. Every step had to be precise. Every decision had to anticipate the social fallout. In Harlem, the act of helping one person, especially someone outside the system, could be misread as weakness. Conversely, inaction could undermine decades of carefully cultivated fear and loyalty. Power was fragile, and it demanded constant demonstration, not just through violence, but through decisiveness, strategy, and the occasional display of unexpected mercy. Bumpy's calculus was criminally efficient. He understood that influence extended beyond the immediate. A word from him could halt a beating in the alley. A tip to a landlord could restore heat. A confrontation with a son could recalibrate the trajectory of a life teetering between ruin and survival. Every choice had to balance pragmatism with morality, perception with outcome. By the time the Cadillac rolled toward Elizabeth Carter's apartment, Bumpy had already begun orchestrating a networked intervention, an invisible operation that spanned the underworld and the fragile infrastructure of Harlem's poor. The Cadillac rolled through the frozen streets of Harlem, every turn and stop orchestrated with precision. Bumpy Johnson did not speak much, but each word carried weight. Each glance communicated instructions to Hulette, his seasoned bodyguard. Their mission was clear: restore warmth, light, and sustenance to Elizabeth Carter, while simultaneously addressing the violent, self-destructive behavior of her son, Edward. In the city's underworld, influence extended beyond threats and money. It was enacted through movement, observation, and carefully timed interventions. Bumpy knew this, and every decision reflected decades of mastering a system built on fear, loyalty, and ruthless efficiency. Elizabeth sat shivering in the back seat, wrapped in Bumpy's camel hair overcoat. The cold had begun to leach into her bones, but the physical warmth was secondary to the relief of agency. Finally, someone listened. Someone acted without question. Bumpy's eyes studied her, noting the trembling in her hands, the pain radiating from her hip, the fragility of a life pushed to its limits. Yet even in her weakness, he saw resilience. She had endured decades of systemic neglect, abuse, and poverty. Her very survival was a testament to quiet tenacity. And now, Bumpy would manipulate his network to ensure that her endurance was rewarded, not extinguished. First, the apartment. He instructed Hulette to move swiftly, but with discretion. The landlord, a man accustomed to intimidation, would be confronted indirectly, leveraging both fear and inevitability. A few phone calls, a discreet visit, and the heat and electricity would be restored without public spectacle. Money would be transferred, bills paid, groceries purchased, all executed under the guise of efficiency. In Harlem's delicate ecosystem, these actions served multiple purposes. They ensured Elizabeth's survival, demonstrated Bumpy's reach, and reinforced the notion that intervention, when necessary, could be absolute and untraceable. Simultaneously, Edward's trajectory demanded scrutiny. His addiction had rendered him unpredictable, capable of extreme violence, yet still tethered to fleeting moments of lucidity. Bumpy understood that confronting Edward required balance, aggression, tempered with guidance, to prevent further harm without creating enemies. The alleys, docks, and liquor stores where Edward sought his temporary solace would soon become arenas of negotiation. Surveillance, subtle intimidation, and careful psychological pressure would guide Edward toward a temporary alignment with Bumpy's directives. This was not coercion alone. It was strategy, an assertion control over chaos. In the streets outside, Harlem's criminal hierarchy continued its routines unaware of the Cadillac's mission. Numbers games, illicit bars, and underground betting dens operated like clockwork, but Bumpy's presence reshaped the immediate environment. Orders were passed along invisible lines. Loyalists understood the subtle shifts in protocol. Even minor missteps, an unsettled debt, an overdue payment, a disrespectful glance, could trigger swift consequences. In that ecosystem, the survival of one elderly woman required the orchestration of an entire criminal infrastructure, each element calibrated for precision. Bumpy Johnson did not improvise. He commanded. Edward Carter did not see the Cadillac approach. His world was a haze of alcohol, shame, and fleeting memories of a life that had promised more than the streets ever delivered. The alley behind Cohen's liquor store reeked of spilled spirits and desperation, a haven for the city's forgotten men who wandered between drink and theft. Edward's movements were sloppy, hands trembling as he grasped the bottle like a lifeline. To any observer, he was just another lost soul, a casualty of systemic neglect. But Bumpy Johnson had seen him. Every action, every stumble, every expression of frustration was cataloged in real time, a map of vulnerability and opportunity. When Bumpy stepped from the Cadillac, Edward did not recognize the man approaching. Authority carried no uniform here. It was woven into every measured step, every glance that weighed the chaos before it. The presence of Hulette, silent but menacing, framed the encounter with a threat that Edward could not ignore. For the first time in years, someone confronted him without fear, someone whose power was absolute and whose attention was focused entirely on him. There was no shouting, no entreaty, only the cold weight of inevitability. Bumpy's eyes measured Edward's hesitation, calculating the layers of shame, anger, and addiction. Every word he would speak needed to be precise. Every pause a lever to extract compliance without rebellion. Bumpy did not act out of rage. He acted out of order. In Harlem, a son who struck his elderly mother was not just failing his family. He was violating the silent code that governed human decency, the limits of which Bumpy enforced with lethal precision when necessary. The first few sentences were simple, deliberate, establishing both dominance and observation. Edward flinched under the gaze of a man who had controlled entire neighborhoods through fear and respect, understanding immediately that any further transgression would trigger consequences beyond anything his alcohol-addled mind could predict. Yet there was a strange undertone of opportunity in Bumpy's calm, a chance for redemption, if Edward could recognize it, if he could accept the terms offered by someone who lived by logic and consequence rather than sentiment. The confrontation evolved into psychological pressure, a measured series of truths designed to penetrate Edward's defenses. Bumpy recounted observations of his past, highlighting the man Edward had once been, intelligent, capable, and respected in fleeting glimpses, contrasting that memory with the destruction wrought by addiction. Each word was a tool, each pause a lever, each gesture an unspoken threat and promise simultaneously. Edward's shame deepened, his anger flickering but restrained, the tension coiling between despair and recognition. In that alley, Bumpy enacted control not through brute force alone, but through the undeniable presence of strategy, history, and the certainty of inevitable accountability. By the time the Cadillac would return to take Elizabeth home, Edward's path had been temporarily realigned. The intervention was surgical. Survival, boundaries, and obedience enforced without public spectacle, without blood spilled on the icy pavement. In Harlem, power was a currency that required constant demonstration, and Bumpy Johnson's silent orchestration ensured that even the city's weakest, most desperate elements were accounted for, corrected, and reminded of the cost of transgression. This was control executed with precision, the kind only a lifetime spent navigating crime, loyalty, and violence could achieve. News traveled through Harlem faster than any newspaper, faster than any gossip from corner barbershops or the whispers at back-alley gambling dens. Yet the word of Bumpy Johnson's intervention with Elizabeth Carter did not spread through idle chatter. It traveled through channels he controlled. Lieutenants, runners, and informants relayed observations, updates, and confirmations, each link in a chain calibrated for efficiency. The network was a living organism, fed by loyalty, fear, and a deep understanding of cause and effect. In this ecosystem, actions carried consequences both immediate and delayed, and Bumpy's influence radiated far beyond a Cadillac and the alley behind Cohen's liquor store. The Underworld understood that Johnson's decisions were never impulsive. Each intervention, each act of discipline, served multiple purposes. helping Elizabeth Carter reinforce his image as a protector, a figure whose reach extended even into the lives of those untouched by the machinery of crime. Simultaneously, the message to Edward, the calculated pressure, the enforced boundaries, was a reminder to every street-level operator. Defiance carried cost. In Harlem, power was not just displayed, it was encoded into daily life, inscribed into the routines of those who survived on its terms. Surveillance was central to the system. Bumpy did not need to see every corner in person. He had eyes everywhere. Trusted allies watched docks, alleys, and bars, noting patterns of behavior, identifying threats, and reporting anomalies. Informants within factories, janitorial crews, and storefronts provided intelligence about potential rival activity or social unrest. The black market, gambling dens, and policy shops were all nodes in intricate lattice, each node transmitting data upward. Bumpy's authority depended on constant information flow, anticipation before reaction, strategy before violence. The act of helping a single elderly woman was as much an exercise in influence as a moral decision. It demonstrated both control over chaos and the ability to correct disorder without overexposing himself. At the same time, federal scrutiny hovered nearby. The FBI, NYPD, and Treasury agents were engaged in painstaking surveillance of Harlem's networks. They tracked meetings, monitored communications, and attempted to penetrate closed circles with wiretaps and informants. Yet Bumpy's organization was layered and compartmentalized. Knowledge was segmented. Trust was currency. Only a few individuals ever knew the full scope of his operations. The intervention with Elizabeth, the orchestration of Edward's containment, even the restoration of heat and food to a single apartment, all executed without leaving trails that federal eyes could trace directly back to him. Through this network, Harlem's criminal ecosystem became predictable and pliable. Violent disputes were minimized because the stakes were clear. Loyalty was reinforced because benefits and consequences were visible. Chaos was constrained because Bumpy's calculations accounted for it at every level. By the time Elizabeth returned to a warm, illuminated apartment, the mechanisms of Harlem's underworld had already absorbed and processed the event. Every operator, every observer, understood without question that Johnson's reach extended beyond his physical presence, beyond immediate streets, and into the very fabric of survival and obedience in the neighborhood. In Harlem's underworld, every action carried symbolic weight, and Bumpy Johnson understood the resonance of deeds as much as the currency of fear. Helping Elizabeth Carter was not just an isolated act. It was a demonstration of how authority could extend beyond the expected bounds of violence. Every lieutenant, every street operative, every rival watching from the shadows absorbed a lesson. Johnson's power was absolute, but was measured, disciplined, and calculated. Acts of mercy were as deliberate as acts of retribution, each reinforcing the structure he controlled. Loyalty was not bought. It was earned through consistent enforcement of order and consequence. This careful manipulation of perception reinforced alliances that were often fragile. Bumpy maintained relationships with rival operators, with corrupt officials, with those who moved goods and intelligence through Harlem's shadow economy. Every interaction carried multiple layers of implication. A deal struck here might buy silence there. A favor granted could leverage obedience elsewhere. The restoration of Elizabeth's heat, her groceries, her security, rippled outward through these networks. It was a demonstration that Bumpy could intervene in the lives of civilians and criminals alike, enforcing rules that transcended simple street disputes. Those who had tested him in the past, or who might consider doing so in the future, recognized that his calculations included every possible angle, and that consequence was inevitable. Yet these actions also exposed the tension inherent to criminal hierarchies, the collision between personal morality and organizational logic. Bumpy had cultivated a code, a framework of what was permissible and what could never be tolerated, protecting the innocent, ensuring survival, enforcing discipline. All these operated under a singular logic, the stability of his domain. He did not act from charity. He acted from the understanding that unchecked weakness could destabilize his environment. Allowing Edward to continue assaulting his mother without intervention would ripple outward, undermining obedience, weakening loyalty, and emboldening challengers. The act of intervention, therefore, was both practical and symbolic. reinforcing the subtle equilibrium that governed Harlem's criminal order. Street rumors carried pieces of these truths, but only insiders understood the full calculus. Observers at bars, in betting parlors, and on street corners pieced together fragments. A Cadillac seen outside Elizabeth Carter's apartment. The whispered cautionary tale of a young man forced into compliance. The invisible hand that ensured survival and justice alike. These narratives reinforce fear, yes, but also a grudging respect. Johnson's network was not chaotic. It was anticipatory, responsive, and inhumanly precise when required. By executing strategy in plain sight, yet leaving no direct trace, he demonstrated mastery over both environment and perception, over human behavior, and over the fragile balance of power. The underworld hierarchy, therefore, functioned as a living organism. Acts like these were nodes in a complex system of checks and balances, maintaining order through fear, influence, and selective intervention. By the time Elizabeth had secured her apartment and Edward had been corralled, Harlem had already integrated the lesson. Bumpy Johnson was not just a gangster. He was an arbiter, a strategist, a figure whose interventions commanded obedience and respect as effectively as any threat of violence. Every movement in the city's shadows, every alliance, every whispered conversation now carried his invisible presence. The reach of Bumpy Johnson extended far beyond the streets of Harlem, threading its influence through the cold, echoing corridors of prison walls. Even behind bars, the hierarchy of the underworld persisted, and reputation was currency more potent than cash. Word of his intervention with Elizabeth Carter traveled quickly, carried by inmates who had connections outside and inside the system alike. To those who respected power, it reinforced a principle known throughout criminal networks. Crossing Bumpy's boundaries or failing to respect the weak carried consequences that could follow you anywhere, even into confinement. Inside the penitentiary, alliances were fragile, shifting with each whispered conversation. Each day of survival, Bumpy's reputation acted as a stabilizing force, an unseen hand guiding behavior. Inmates who once challenged authority reconsidered, recognizing that his reach transcended walls and bars. Those seeking protection, influence, or leverage within the prison understood that affiliation, or at least recognition of Bumpy's authority, could mean the difference between survival and harm. In this world, intelligence was as vital as strength, observation more lethal than any weapon. His network of loyalists ensured that information flowed efficiently. Rival plots were intercepted, conflict defused before escalation, and opportunities exploited to maintain equilibrium in a violent, unpredictable ecosystem. Prison politics were governed by codes that mirrored the streets but intensified the stakes. The code of silence, the unwritten rules regarding loyalty, respect, and retribution, was absolute. Betrayal was punished swiftly and without hesitation. Bumpy's name alone could enforce obedience, aligning factions in ways that protected allies and neutralized threats. The story of Edward Carter and his mother became more than a personal intervention. It became an example of the type of authority that could enforce morality, even in spaces traditionally resistant to oversight. Every inmate who learned of it understood the duality of Bumpy's approach. Measured mercy when deserved, unyielding discipline when crossed. In these corridors, alliances were constantly tested. Loyalty could be purchased, borrowed, or coerced, but real power came from respect and fear, tightly intertwined. Bumpy's operatives maintained surveillance even here, quietly monitoring rival gangs, anticipating moves, and ensuring that influence flowed according to the same structured logic applied on the streets. The prison ecosystem functioned as an extension of Harlem's underworld, a microcosm where order, chaos, and strategy intersected with brutal precision. Every decision, from the enforcement of petty disputes to the handling of serious transgressions, was informed by an understanding of cause, effect, and the inexorable consequences of failing to comply. Through these invisible networks, Bumpy Johnson reinforced the notion that his dominion was comprehensive. Streets, alleys, and apartments were merely the surface. Behind bars, his calculated interventions demonstrated that influence was not bound by geography, but by respect, intelligence, and the disciplined execution of authority. Every inmate who heard the tale of Elizabeth Carter understood one undeniable truth. In Harlem and beyond, Bumpy Johnson's power was absolute, and no act of cruelty or negligence toward the vulnerable would escape notice or consequence. While Bumpy Johnson's dominion stretched through streets and prisons alike, federal agencies were quietly closing in. The FBI, the Treasury Department, and the NYPD monitored Harlem with a mixture of fascination and frustration. Every tip, every informant report, and every intercepted conversation painted fragments of the same picture. A man whose influence was omnipresent, yet methodical, precise, and nearly invisible. Agents cataloged meetings at gambling dens, coded signals between street operatives, and the flow of cash through policy shops. Yet the interventions, like the one involving Elizabeth Carter, remained hidden, untraceable, a ghostly testament to the depth of Johnson's control. Surveillance was a chess game, and Bumpy played it like a grandmaster. Every public appearance, every intervention, was calculated for maximum effect on allies and rivals alike, while minimizing exposure to law enforcement. Street crews were divided into compartments, each knowing only enough to perform their role, never enough to threaten a whole network. Informants and loyalists ensured that intelligence flowed in every direction, but always under Johnson's command. Even Edward Carter's confrontation and subsequent realignment became part of this invisible strategy, demonstrating authority, reinforcing obedience, and simultaneously avoiding any evidence that could be used against him. Yet pressure from federal investigations forced constant adaptation. Bumpy's organization had to anticipate raids, wiretaps, and undercover operatives, blending everyday criminal activity with psychological management of his people. Alliances were strengthened not just through payment or threat, but through calculated demonstrations of power, like the discreet intervention for Elizabeth Carter. Every act served multiple purposes: survival of the vulnerable, enforcement of the criminal code, and signaling to observers, both inside the network and outside, that Bumpy's influence was inescapable. In Harlem, subtlety often outweighed violence, and intelligence often outweighed strength. Now, halfway through our descent into this underworld, pause and commit to the story. Comment Bumpy sees all twice in the comment section. Do it to lock in your understanding of the stakes, the rules, and the power structures at play. This is not a request. It's a reflection of the way authority moves unseen, shaping lives and decisions without ever revealing its full extent. Those who recognize the mechanics of power, loyalty, and fear see the world as Bumpy sees it, an ecosystem of human behavior to be understood, manipulated, and occasionally corrected. In the interplay between federal scrutiny and street-level enforcement, Bumpy's genius was revealed. He maintained control without drawing attention, corrected injustice without leaving a trail, and managed risk without hesitation. Every ally and adversary learned that survival in his orbit required intelligence, compliance, and recognition of consequences. The Cadillac, the alley behind Cohen's liquor store, and the warm apartment of Elizabeth Carter were more than isolated moments. They were demonstrations of strategy, psychological mastery, and influence. In Harlem's underworld, nothing happened by chance, and every intervention echoed across streets, corridors, and investigation files. Bumpy Johnson's world was a careful equilibrium of morality and strategy, a landscape where loyalty, fear, and calculation dictated every action. In Harlem, power was not static. It shifted constantly, influenced by ambition, desperation, and the unseen forces of federal surveillance. Bumpy understood that authority was most effective when subtle, when it corrected disorder without resorting to overt violence, yet always carried the implicit threat of consequence. The intervention with Elizabeth Carter exemplified this principle. A single act of protection, executed with precision, resonated across the criminal ecosystem, reinforcing his dominion without triggering unnecessary attention. Every operator in his network internalized the lesson. Weakness, exploitation, and neglect would not be tolerated. Obedience, intelligence, and respect were rewarded. Bumpy's capacity to blend pragmatism with moral calculus allowed him to manipulate outcomes with surgical accuracy. Edward Carter's temporary compliance demonstrated the psychology of fear and hope in action. A man coerced into recognition of wrongdoing, yet given the opportunity for redemption, all orchestrated without public spectacle. The narrative of intervention became a silent message woven into the fabric of Harlem. Authority was absolute, but justice could be measured, selective, and deliberate. In the back alleys, the policy shops, and the gambling dens, stories of Bumpy's influence circulated. They were told in hushed tones, fragments pieced together from observation and rumor. Yet each fragment reinforces control. Competitors understood the stakes. Lieutenants recognized the consequences of disloyalty. Even the weakest members of the ecosystem internalized the boundaries he enforced. Power, Bumpy knew, was maintained not through indiscriminate violence, but through precise interventions, calculated mercy, and the constant reinforcement of order. In this way, Harlem's underworld functioned as a living organism, responsive, disciplined, and tightly controlled. Yet the moral tension remained. Bumpy's interventions were calculated, but they were not devoid of conscience. In moments like Elizabeth Carter's survival, he confronted the limits of his own detachment, the boundaries of his empathy, and the human cost of criminal enterprise. His decisions rippled outward, affecting lives, alliances, and rivalries, yet they also reflected a rare acknowledgement of human vulnerability in a world dominated by brutality. Authority, strategy, and morality intertwined in a delicate balance, each decision carrying weight far beyond the immediate moment. By the time the Cadillac returned Elizabeth to her restored apartment, Bumpy had reinforced both his influence and the underlying moral code of his domain. The streets of Harlem had witnessed a demonstration of power that was as much psychological as it was operational. Surveillance, alliances, interventions, and the careful orchestration of consequences solidified his control, ensuring that even the most chaotic elements, addiction, desperation, federal investigation, remained within the parameters he dictated. In the shadows, in the alleys, and behind every closed door, the quiet authority of Bumpy Johnson extended, shaping Harlem's underworld with invisible yet absolute precision. The Cadillac rolled through Harlem one final time, Elizabeth Carter safely inside, her apartment restored, and Edward temporarily subdued. Yet the consequences of Bumpy Johnson's intervention extended far beyond a single family or a single street. In the underworld, every act radiated outward, shifting balances, recalibrating alliances, and reinforcing hierarchies. Competitors who had watched in the shadows understood that Bumpy's authority was not limited to brute force. It was intelligent applied with precision, control enforced with subtlety, and morality exercised selectively, all serving the greater objective of survival and order within a chaotic ecosystem. The ripple effects touched those both inside and outside the criminal network. Street crews internalized new boundaries. Federal agents cataloged patterns they could not yet fully decode. Neighborhood residents whisper about the mysterious man who could deliver both fear and protection with equal facility. Edward Carter's life, for the first time in years, encountered intervention that demanded accountability, creating a temporary pause in his descent into self-destruction. Elizabeth Carter's survival became both a literal and symbolic reminder that in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, even the most marginalized could, under the right circumstances, find protection, but only when his authority deemed it necessary. This orchestration of power, however, was not without cost. Maintaining control required constant vigilance, the management of alliances fraught with competing ambitions, and the psychological weight of decisions that could not be undone. Bumpy's network depended on obedience enforced through fear, intelligence leveraged for compliance, and the invisible hand of consequence guiding every interaction. In a world where survival depended on understanding and anticipating human behavior, every act, even one born of empathy, was calculated, executed with precision, and embedded within the larger framework of underworld order. Harlem streets, its alleys, and its corridors have been subtly reshaped. A man who once existed on the margins of society, Edward, had been momentarily realigned. A woman whose existence teetered on deprivation, Elizabeth, had been restored to warmth, sustenance, and dignity. These were not acts of charity. They were strategic interventions reinforcing the very structure that allowed Bumpy Johnson to dominate. His influence, built over decades, extended beyond transactions and violence, reaching into the psychological and moral fabric of the city itself. Ultimately, the story of that February day in 1956 was more than an isolated incident. It revealed the mechanics of control in Harlem's underworld, the delicate interplay of fear, loyalty, observation, and morality that define survival. It exposed the cost of authority, the subtlety of enforcement, and the invisible yet absolute reach of a man who understood both the fragility and resilience of human behavior. Bumpy Johnson's legacy, cemented in moments like these, endures as a testament to strategic application of power. Precise, calculated, and undeniably consequential, a force that shaped Harlem long after Cadillac disappeared into the shadows.